Hi, I'm your host, Prateek Panda, and you're listening to Impulse, the influencer marketing podcast by Phyllo. Here, we talk to the best and brightest in influencer marketing to help answer all your questions, from finding the right influencers to making sure you have the best influencer marketing strategy. So let's get started. Right, welcome everybody to another episode of Impulse, the influencer marketing podcast. Joining today is Aaron Costa. He's the director of client management and engagement at Hylink Group, a leading independent digital and full service agency. He's a marketing expert with over 25 years of experience working with a variety of different agencies and also has an extensive track record of brand building for organizations such as Google, SC Johnson, and American Express. Thank you so much for joining us, Aaron. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Right off the bat, let's start with one hot controversial take about influencer marketing that you have, which maybe you believe strongly in, but not everybody else might agree to.
Well, I think it's less of a hot take, but I think what has become a large challenge for agencies and the brands that we represent is our ability to actually connect with especially macro and micro influencers directly, and to really have them generate what I would refer to as true organic content, or content that feels more appropriate for the audiences we're trying to attract. I know personally, especially over the past 2 years or so now, I've had, whether it's my media team or whether it's account services folks or project management, we'll collect a brief from a client where we want to involve an influencer. We'll identify 100 influencers who are potentially great for this campaign. We'll reach out to 100 of them and we'll get one response from one of them. So what we're left with is now utilizing these influencer agencies to actually connect directly to influencers. So again, that same brief, those same 100 influencers we contacted for a particular client, I go to an influencer agency. I won't name one in particular. There are a lot of large ones. There are some small ones. And when I give them the brief, the next day I'll get back 99 of the 100 that we had already identified we want to work with. But again, we can't connect with them directly, and ultimately we're now bound, within an sort of call it a middle person environment, where we have to interact with this influencer agency as opposed to the way it was previously, as influencer marketing became more popular, where you were more likely to connect directly with an influencer, come to an agreement, come to a shared amount of content they were going to create, come to compensation, and move forward. So what it's doing is it's slowing down the process of our ability to react quickly to onboard influencers. And also, again, it's just become a more procedural process, which again, I feel like dilutes the impact of influencer marketing across the board.
Got it. And there are a couple of things there, right? One is this whole agency influencer relationship, right? A lot of brands, especially the small ones, are struggling to find the same kind of responses that you are talking about, right? When they're trying to reach out to influencers, micro influencers, nano influencers directly and not getting a response, but they might not be at a place where they can afford a big agency. What do you think is happening that the agency is able to get a response, but a direct brand outreach is not getting?
Well, ultimately, what we've done with influencers and content creators on a whole is we've added them to what I would refer to as a talent pool. They're much more akin these days to an actor or a model, in the sense that you must go through their representation in order to engage with them. So where that has elevated their status in some areas, again, it makes it, to your point, it makes it much harder for a smaller brand who therefore might have been able to to hire a micro influencer, and spend a few $1,000s, let's say, and have them create some content, versus needing to engage with a much larger organization, which quite frankly needs to, is going to take their share as well as their talents, fees as well. So we've added cost and again, time and call it, procedural impact to our, for anyone's ability to actually engage with influencers these days or content creators.
Got it. Makes sense. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into influencer marketing, particularly in the small brands versus big brand space, because I want to hear your perspective on both. But before we get there, tell us a little bit more about Hylink Group and particularly your role there. What do you do?
Sure. So Hylink Group actually is a global agency. We were founded in 1994 in China, of all places. And we're actually, our first clientele were in the auto space. And our founder, ultimately, what he was successful at doing was during the early days of, call it the early internet Wild West, so to speak, he had the foresight to look into advertising inventory of websites and actually purchased inventory and then resold it to to other agencies, advertisers, and brands. And that's how we initially started our business. Since then, we've grown. We're up to 15, 16 offices globally. We have a very heavy presence in APAC as well, but we are our major headquarters is here in Los Angeles, as well as satellite offices we just recently opened in Bogota and New York. We're very active in the EU as well. But again, we do have what I refer to as APAC expertise, just because of our large presence there. We're actually probably one of the largest, if not the largest, media purchaser in APAC these days as well. A lot of times agencies may be working with us and not even be aware of it just because of the size and scale of the amount of media that we run through APAC currently. Hylink Group, though, is made up of 4 distinct agencies. There is Hylink Media, which, as appropriately so, handles media planning, buying, and execution, and analytics. There's Hylink Creative, which is our creative and strategic agency, where we do more brand consultancy and more traditional creative services. There's also Hylink Forge, which is our technology agency, where we do app development, web development, cybersecurity, all the things you would associate with a technology agency. And as well as there's Hylink Public Relations, which is our PR wing, which again is highly active and again in our support of a lot of our U.S. brands and brands in the Americas, and in terms of running their PR services, especially in APAC. My role obviously is I sit in the Hylink Group, as it were, and I sit across all of the agencies, and I act as the leadership of our client services team as well as our strategy.
All right, awesome. Thanks for that, background. Tell me a little bit more about, influencer marketing, particularly in the small brands versus big brands context, because you've worked with big brands like Google and American Express, right? And they have this whole brand equity that they've built over time, and they're a lot more sensitive towards how they want to represent their brand, and therefore maybe want to define a particular narrative with an influencer. Whereas a small brand, which might be a direct to consumer e-commerce brand, for example, is just starting out and they don't even have maybe a necessary brand guideline established per se. How do you see influencer marketing in these different lenses, whether you're a big brand or a small?
Well, for big brands, influencer marketing has just become another necessary channel per se. Whereas for a much smaller brand, let's say to your point, like a DTC cosmetics brand, right? That doesn't have the budget and the presence and the current brand and sentiment awareness that a large existing brand called a corporate brand does. For them, that influencer, an influencer would say even 100 or even 150 followers who are very active, can be much more impactful for them in terms of raising brand awareness, increasing positive sentiment. So it's what I see with the larger brands is, again, as we discussed earlier, they're going to the influencer agencies, they're giving a brief. It's more just a part of the agency chain of command, so to speak. And, at this point, it's just another channel. You go to the agency, they acquire talent for you, and they produce content, that is 100% on brand and on, and it follows brand guidelines. But ultimately, what we find is, and especially with those larger influencers, let's say, someone with a following of 5 million people, we know that the engagement rate actually with that is very small, in fact. And the impact that has is negligible at best. So, but again, it's just become this kind of necessary, well, we've got to have TV because people still watch TV. Well, we've got to be on radio because reasons. It's just become a self-fulfilling cycle of, well, here's a channel, so let's create content to put on that channel. And whatever, it costs a lot of money, but we're supposed to do it. Whereas again, the smaller brand, needs to be more mindful of being able to engage with a micro or macro influencer these days, find someone who's appropriate for them. And it's become, quite frankly, and we still work with a lot of SMBs, obviously here in the Americas especially. We find it challenging just based on their budgets, again, to be able to engage influencers and it will be appropriate. What we find is, especially for cosmetics, for skincare, for fashion, beauty, these verticals especially, influencer marketing is amazingly impactful. It really is. The amount of social sharing that we see. I just saw this great T-shirt. I send it to my friend. He sends it to his friend. That direct consumer model really benefits from those smaller influencers, because again, their audience is much more engaged, because quite frankly, that's why they only have 150 to 200 followers, let's say. But because they're more active and they're more likely to view that content on a regular basis, and they have positive sentiment towards that influencer or content creator, they're more likely to again engage with that smaller brand. And when those smaller influencers do get engaged by larger brands, what we find is that the sentiment is not positive. We find that it's, we get the claims of, well, there's my favorite fashionista person, and you know what, now she's working with this huge brand, I no longer trust her. She's obviously just being paid to do this. There's this odd belief that influencers creating content at the smaller level are somehow more, for lack of a better term, down to earth than a larger influencer, let's say, who has 1 million followers. And there's quite frankly, there's a little bit of truth to that too. Someone who's creating content for their love of creating content because they truly enjoy it, is more likely to be engaged and to get engaged by a smaller brand, because they want to try the product, or they are a fan of the product. They just want to evangelize it. Yes, there's compensation involved. I mean, there's their time and there's effort, of course, but ultimately those people in those smaller influencers, smaller content creators, they have more, call it brand validity with their audiences than the larger influencers do, at least in my expectation.
Got it. And something that keeps coming up is the whole thing around authenticity and trust, right? And the reason influencer marketing as a channel works is because consumers trust that the influencers that they follow are sharing the right things, and there is that level of trust. And as a small brand, right, how do you make sure you find influencers that can be authentic to your brand?
Well, what I see and what I've been successful with, and my team here has been successful with for influencer marketing over call it even the more recent term of the 6 to 9 months, is identifying influencers who have a potential, let's say. People who are content creators that are, creating content on the regular that are authentic, to your point, but really don't have much of a following, and ultimately engaging with them in the moments before they start to get noticed by larger organizations, larger brands, or influencer marketing agencies. So you're building your own talent pool, so to speak. It really comes down to the cultural awareness of our creative teams, of our strategy teams, to identify these people, when they come across their own personal feeds, let's say. So, I know recently, we work with a lot of luxury fashion, beauty brands, skincare here at Hylink. And ultimately, so therefore we, especially our strategy team, our creative team tends to follow, influencers in that space and content creators, and they easily identify, call it new influencers who are, maybe only have a following of 5, 10, 15 people that are, kind of more of a personal level. And again, there's that authenticity right there. And what we do is once we've identified those influencers, we reach out to them and say, hey, in the near future, we'd love to bring you something to create content about. So we're kind of we're creating our own stable of talent, if that doesn't sound offensive, we're creating our own talent pool ultimately that we can utilize down the road. And even if they do start to get larger and do have representation moving forward, we've at least, started that process of working with them. We have an open line of communication. They're more likely to respond to an email or a phone call than just, blindly sending a DM on Instagram to, a potential influencer we'd like to engage with.
All right, awesome. Talking about influencer marketing, right? The concept of influence has always existed. As a friend, as a buddy, whatever, we influence each other into making certain purchases. The concept of influencer marketing per se might be relatively new. You've spent 25 years in the marketing side, working with agencies as well as brands. What have you seen as the evolution of influencer marketing, and what's gotten us here?
Well, again, I often hide behind, my early days of influencer marketing, because I don't hold myself personally responsible, but, it wasn't just me, obviously, but there's many of us in the advertising space, probably in the late 2000s, we're starting to see our ability, for social media, obviously, to be a selling platform. And ultimately, again, the celebrity, presence on social media was becoming much more apparent. So, in 2009, 2010, I personally, working with Sears and Kmart, an unfortunate set of brands that have become depreciated, we were paying celebrity, and who shall remain nameless, $10,000 a tweet, to push new product out into the marketplace. At the time, that Twitter was, one of the main platforms we utilize for influencer marketing because Twitter has always had a sort of instantaneous effect and a very large reach, and the frequency in which it generates engagement, has always been quite good. But and that's at a time when that celebrity, she had call it 500,000 followers, but the engagement rate with those followers was much better because there wasn't so many people in the celebrity, especially influencer space, and it really was in the early days of it in terms of marketing effort. So what we've seen is that shift, whereas and again, now we'll figure out who this is. When we see her daughter these days, as a celebrity influencer who's being paid $1 million for an Instagram post, right? And she has 10 million followers. But again, the amount of expense we would incur with that is just, thousands times what it was, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And ultimately, again, but we're seeing almost a similar engagement rate because, again, at 10 million followers, you're less likely to actually get active engagement from any of those viewers. And because it's become sort of just the norm, we've established normalcy with influencer marketing. Again, it's treated much more as what it truly is. To your point, it is just influence. It is just a commercial per se. It's just the platform has changed from being, a TVC on network television to being, the 15-second video post on Instagram these days. So, and again, the cost and the rapid increase in the amount of expense that we've incurred, in a decade, plus, has just been amazing to me to see to how much we're willing to, again, kind of create a status, a status of normalcy of this being a channel in social media and utilizing our talent to fill that, to fill content into there. But ultimately, it's ultimately just a repurposing of the same kind of mentality of selling with television commercials, we've been doing for decades.
Got it. And do you think it's relatively okay to say that the influencers with large following are more of a branding visibility sort of exercise versus the smaller ones actually drive better engagement and ROI?
Oh, absolutely. So the larger influencers are just brand awareness ultimately. Again, because as I scroll through my own personal social feeds, whether it be Instagram, whether it be Twitter, there's really there's so much content being generated, so much paid content, as it were, and is unauthentic to that sense as me as a consumer, because again, I'm treating these influencers as to what they are, which is again talent. They're engaged in an active brand campaign, let's say, that's ultimately just brand awareness, and again, just filling that channel. When it comes to, again, on a more personal level, it comes to my particular hobbies or interests, and an influencer or content creator that I follow, when they create content for a brand or organization, I'm much more likely to engage with it or to feel it's authentic because, again, I know that I'm one of 26 people that follows this person's content. So that the fact that a brand is connected with them makes me feel more comfortable engaging with that content. And again, if it's germane to my interest or my hobby or whatever it may be, I'm much more likely to engage in that because quite frankly, it is what I'm looking for. I'm looking to digest content about something I enjoy, like, or appreciate. So I'm, if they connect directly and they go, hey, I've got this great t-shirt company and their products are awesome, I'm much more likely as a consumer personally to take that next step, to click on that link, to engage with that brand or product. And I'm much more likely to be converted ultimately because, again, I know that I'm one of 26 other people at the start who are engaging with this content. And yes, through social sharing that can reach an exponential growth potential of, tens of thousands of people. Let's say I share it with 2 people, they share it with 2 people, so on and so on. And ultimately, the social sharing factor, increases the reach and frequency of that content. But again, because it's coming from such an authentic place and it's much more likely to be authentic, I as a consumer, and I feel like consumers in general, are much more likely to engage with that brand at the end of the day.
Got it. That makes sense. And, you mentioned a little bit at the beginning that about Hylink Group starting from China, right? Is it okay if we talk for a few minutes about China in the influencer marketing context?
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is what we've seen a growth over the past 5 or 6 years in not just China, but in APAC as well, is the rise of the virtual influencer. We've seen, mass brands, but Amazon, Samsung, tons of luxury and beauty brands engage with virtual influencers, which is something that, quite frankly, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I think we would have almost thought is unheard of. And it's something out of a futuristic sci-fi movie, but we see these virtual influencers having followings in the millions at this point. And it's not just APAC, but we have seen the growth there Quite and in all honesty, actually, Hylink Group is actually a part has a is a part owner of a very large virtual influencer, actually, who's based out of APAC, who's been used by major brands, major organizations. So we saw the growth potential several years ago, and actually bought into the ownership of a virtual influencer, who we continue to utilize with our existing clients and potential clients. So what's interesting is, again, the space that they are most successful in has generally been in beauty, fashion, luxury, skincare. But we're also seeing them break out again into the mass market, where we've seen high profile campaigns again with technology companies like Samsung, with retail companies and like Amazon, where they've done cross promotional products developed with these virtual influencers. It's become very apparent that, because of if we're going to accept that an influencer is quote unquote unauthentic, well, why not just create one? And then we no longer have to have this disbelief that, wow, I can't believe that my favorite influencer so-and-so is now working with, a technology brand. I thought they only worked with skincare brands. So it's highly interesting to see how that it started mostly in APAC and is now spread, globally, but just how many followers and how much impact a virtual influencer has in the marketplace.
This whole thing about virtual influencers is fascinating for me, right? And since you brought up this topic, right, let's dive a little bit deeper. Do you think consumers or viewers know that they are following a virtual influencer, or are most
I
of
mean,
them?
absolutely. If for someone to look at, Little Michaela, let's say, who's a very, very popular virtual influencer, who's kind of, not been very present over the past year or so. Let's say, as an example, where, just a few years ago, she was doing massive campaigns with Samsung, with Calvin Klein. Anyone who would, view that content and not realize that it is, a computer generated, avatar, if you will, I pity them. I just don't see how it's possible to see where, again, and let's say Little Michaela in this example, will constantly vocalize the fact that she is what she refers to it as a robot, and so a lot of these times these virtual influencers, just again the style in which they're represented, is an obvious note to their computer generated self. But what I find is more interesting is that that we're creating backstories for these virtual influencers. We're creating lives for them. They have dates. They interview people. They interact with real world environments, like we saw. We've seen at festivals, let's say Coachella, or the closing of the Olympic Games, a few years ago, where these virtual influencers are participating, in the form of holograms or large projections, and are interacting in a real time basis, because either they're driven by AI, so they can respond directly, or quite frankly, their responses and their engagement is much more like a puppet, if you will. That there's someone sitting at a keyboard typing their responses, to the question that was just asked or answered, in whatever format they may be in. But no, I think people, again, are embracing the virtual influencers because you can suspend your disbelief at that point. It doesn't matter that they're working with this brand and that brand now. You like this virtual influencers for whatever reasons you have, whether it's an affinity to their, to their style, to, the kind of content they've created previously, or whatever it may be. You're identifying with them as an avatar. And ultimately, again, there is none of that need to feel, well, was this authentic or inauthentic, because it's quote unquote all inauthentic, because again, they are just a robot.
Awesome. That's an interesting take, right? And I feel like this entire space is a really strong learning in consumer psychology, and how as consumers, we can get influenced, not necessarily so easily, but we don't even need another person to influence us anymore.
No, it's amazing. It's a very fair point. Ultimately, again, that virtual influencer was created by a group, and then they were, that virtual influencer was onboarded by, let's say, a creative agency like ours, and then, dictated a brief, and then, there's an edict to create content around there. So it really is just like it is, the production aspects are very, very traditional, let's say. You're creating a script, you're creating visual elements to go along with things, where we see virtual influencers being put into a situation much more easily. Recently, I made the statement to a client that the best thing about a virtual influencer is they never have a bad hair day. They're never late for set. They never go off script. They're not going to go off brand. They're not going to get a DUI on their way to shoot your content, because they live in a digital space. So we don't have the challenges that we have with real people that do occur with influencers. Because to that point, I've worked with influencers, and then 6 months, you've been successfully working with them for 6, 12 months. They're on brand, they're positioned well, and then they have a real world issue, which creates challenges for both the brand and agency to continue working with them, whatever it may be. They have that bad hair day, let's say, and but with a virtual influencer, we never have any of those concerns. We just don't. We're just our ability to create content, is easier in many aspects. And again, there's little to no concern for them ever damaging the brand or again doing something that could be deemed as detrimental to the brand that they work with.
Yeah, going back to China, right? Influencer marketing is huge in China, and what do you think is working for them? And do you see similar trends coming to North America anytime soon?
No, absolutely. Again, with virtual influencers, not being born in China or APAC per se, but we've seen, their dramatic rise. When we've seen inroads with some of the larger virtual influencers here in the U.S. and the Americas, especially, in the recent, past few years. But we continue to see that growth potential in China, especially. Just due to the fact that their viewing habits and their device habits are much more ingrained in singular platforms like WeChat or Weibo, let's say. The opportunity for content delivery, is much much narrower there. For advertisers like ourselves. So, that call it that bite-sized content that influencers often, are credited with is much more relatively accepted there, and ultimately is much more successful because, we've seen a dramatic decrease in linear television and linear radio and things like that. And again, the content size has really been dictated by the audience, where, people are scrolling constantly on a phone. They don't have time to digest 45 seconds. You're lucky to hold their attention for 2 seconds. So if you can hold their attention for 2 seconds, you might get 13 more seconds out of them, but that's probably it. So, influencer, getting someone to hold on that video content on Instagram, is very hard to do. But again, because of this kind of, call it more singular use platforms that we see in APAC and especially in China, you're basically, that's the only platform that these folks are on. So again, you've got to utilize what is going to best sate their needs for content, which is influencers or content creators in this case, not your minute and a half long TVC per se.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes sense. And talking about influencer marketing again, for folks who are just starting out, right? Like if you're a small brand starting out with influencer marketing, you might be a D2C e-commerce store on Shopify. How do you get started? What are some things to keep in mind?
Well, I think, like I suggested earlier, I think for smaller brands, the opportunity is to create your own talent pool. Right, to identify, a content creator who may have little to no following, but with your assistance as a brand and having giving them credence and giving them, quite frankly, content briefs, and compensating them again, allows the smaller brand to build their own talent pool again, again, as they grow in size and stature, from a content creation standpoint, eventually the influencer may move on from working with that smaller brand. But that's why I think it's a constant cycle. You've got to be constantly identifying, potential influencers, if you will, and identifying them initially as content creators, and then again, forming those relationships early on in their careers, as they obviously are, and then and helping to guide and grow their following through your own efforts. So part of it is what we don't see a lot of in the large brand space is the need for a large brand to promote a large influencer, right? They already have that active following, million plus people. So, but with a smaller, with a micro influencer who has who's again, it's just, let's say a content creator just starting out who has, 6 followers and 4 of them are family members, but you've identified that they, align with your brand. They're part of your potential audience, let's say. My advice to the smaller brand or agency is looking to engage with, smaller influencers for their smaller brands is ultimately to cultivate those relationships early on and to help grow them as a content creator ultimately.
Got it. And, we've been trying out influencer marketing as well for a fair amount of time now. And in the early days, one of the things that I had observed was you have limited budget, but you want to keep trying different influencers. Do you think it's a better strategy to find a few influencers and work with them for slightly longer term projects to see more value rather than trying to test out too many at the same time?
Oh, absolutely. I've personally run campaigns over the past few years where, we have had large budgets, let's say. And what we find is that the more content creators that we work with for a particular campaign, ultimately, again, it dilutes our presence, so to speak, across the content spectrum. So where I have an active client, let's say a CPG client, that I was working with, say, about a year and a half ago, really wanted a summer influencer campaign. We identified, I believe it was 30 or 40 potential influencers. Ultimately, our ability to engage with them was accomplished through working through one of the larger influencer agencies. And what I saw, though, was that, for a similar campaign for another client, another CPG client, where we only had budget, quite frankly, to engage with like 2 or 3 influencers, who ultimately were much smaller audiences. In the larger campaign and with the larger set of influencers and the larger audience, we actually got way less engagement than we did with the smaller campaign and the smaller budget. Because again, once so many of your influencers are part of your talent pool, creating content around your brand space, again, you're oversaturating, so to speak. It's like running, 7 linear commercials in a half an hour for the same, for similar products or from the same brand. At a certain point, people are going to start to tune out the brand. They're going to tune out the content because there's a certain amount of content people will engage with or be satiated by. But once you're overfilling the cup, so to speak, you're wasting effort. So I think that's the challenge, is that I'd rather work, no matter what the budget, I'd rather work with a smaller talent pool, because then there's less likely to have too much crossover, because again, those audiences, they may be similar and you may have some crossover, but again, you're more likely to have more engagement because you're working with less influencers and their message is being spread across distinct audiences versus kind of blanketing, and covering multiple audiences and multiple platforms, where again, there's going to be so much crossover that you're going to lose engagement rates ultimately.
Got it. Makes sense. And we talked a little bit about virtual influencers. What are some other things that you see as the future of influencer marketing?
Well, I think what we're going to see is AI-driven virtual influencers to a much larger degree, where and these computer-generated talent will no longer require the puppeteer. AI has gotten to a place where, scarily in some aspects, where it's hard to tell someone that ChatGTP doesn't exist anymore. It's hard to tell, my sons, for instance, that they shouldn't let ChatGTP write their homework, because it's the Pandora's box has been opened. So I think what we'll see and continue to see is the rise of virtual influencers, who are ultimately the content they're creating, what they're saying, quite frankly, or what they're doing, and the content they create will be driven independently by artificial intelligence, as opposed to someone, for me to brief a creative team on what the virtual influencers should say, and then for them to write scripts and work with the production team to produce that content. I'll be able to, quote unquote, boot up our virtual influencer, have a conversation with them, give them a verbal brief or even a written brief as well that they'll scan, identify, and then they'll go off and they'll create content based on that brief, without, again, having to have someone, to actually be the puppeteer in this instance, to create, to write the script, to position them in a scene, let's say, or, have them hold up a product and talk about it. We will be interacting with a virtual influencer who will have the ability to ostensibly be a person, because quite frankly, that's what we're getting closer to. So, I find it, again, it's scary in some ways, but it's also very exciting, because, if we're going to utilize, this digital talent, then they should have it. They, quite frankly, then and let them do what they do best, which is to create their own content. Now that they're smart enough, scarily again, to actually create that content on their own.
That does sound exciting as well as scary, like you said. Right?
That's a little scary.
Yeah. So switching gears a little to something more personal and fun, if you were to take out an influencer to lunch, who would that person be and why?
That's a very tough one for me. I personally have, there's a number of, call it food influencers that I follow personally. So I'm hard pressed to put one there, because ultimately what I would more prefer is to be able to show up at these influencers' doorsteps and have them create food for me or create a meal for me. But it's also even using the term influencer for what it truly means. I mean, where we bandy about the word influencer in marketing spaces is, again, they're just content creators, they're less likely to be celebrity, but, is that really true? I'm a big fan of I will call him an auteur of Action Bronson, who is a chef, who is a unprofessional wrestler, who is a hip hop artist, who is an artist, who is a writer. So is he truly an influencer? I mean, technically he's a celebrity, right? He has, he's had show on Vice. He produces records, he tours, he creates content. But technically he's also an influencer, right? He creates small bite-sized content that he now produces himself. He has alignment with large brands like New Balance, for instance, who just recently put out a personalized shoe for him, actually several. So again, he's a celebrity, right? But he's technically an influencer because of the way he's being positioned by the brands that he works with, right? So when New Balance utilizes him, he's a celebrity, but he's ultimately an influencer because they're trying to influence people to buy, not only the shoe that they produced with him, but to buy the rest of their offering. If you boil it down to his personal connection to the content he creates, well, again, he's a well-known prolific chef. So he goes and travels and shares his food content. So in that instance, he's kind of more or less a traditional influencer. So again, it's very hard pressed for me to say, is there one influencer I would love? Because ultimately it's hard to define what is an influencer. Again, we can do it, but ultimately we're kind of doing, we're doing someone in this instance, him in particular, we're doing him a disservice by saying, well, he's just an influencer. He's so many more things. And I think a lot of successful influencers these days, celebrity or not per se, are successful because, again, the content they create and the audiences that they're speaking to, myself in this instance being, a heavy food influencer content person, and I digest a lot of that content and I take away from it a lot of the time. But again, it's even using the label of influencer. We really should, we should move away from it. I don't think we will, and I don't think we can. But ultimately, they really are as I've been saying all along, they really are talent. They are a part of the engagement cycle between consumers and brands, and they sit somewhere in between being ultimately the AI or robots that are virtual influencers, and ultimately being, someone just reading a script. They sit in the middle of those two things, so to speak. And that's where, again, that authenticity hopefully comes from. So I know I dodged your question, a whole bunch, but ultimately I don't think there's one influencer or just one that I would love to take out to dinner, because ultimately I'd like to have someone that make me dinner.
Awesome. And that's an amazing answer, right? I asked this question to almost all of my guests, and, typically, people want to meet with someone to learn something or to dive deeper into something. But I think if you're going to meet someone for lunch or dinner, might as well just meet someone who's going to make you an amazing lunch or dinner.
Exactly. So why not? And to me, it's like, well, who would I like to have me make food? Oh, there's so many people. I was thinking about the question, and ultimately I that's why I did dodge the answer a little bit, because I couldn't decide if you actually made me try and decide. What I think, again, is important to note is that because influencers, and influencer marketing has become, just a necessary channel within our marketing activities, I think we will see it coalesce a little bit more, as it's been already, with, again, larger influencers being moved away from, and micro and macro being more the norm. Just in the same way that we now, we, for streaming services or let's call it, visual content, we have a multitude of places we get it. And we'll continue to. We moved from a place where we had, several, let's say in the Americas, several networks of television networks. We had X amount of shows per year. There was, then came along cable networks. We had, a few more venues, and then the feature films go alongside it. And now we have, a multitude of streaming services serving us content, in varying degrees, good or bad, and just so much more of it. We're producing so much more content. So I feel like influencers are, again, just kind of that progression of where advertising and marketing is headed towards, which, again, coming from an authentic place to start, becoming inauthentic, and then retreating back to becoming more authentic as we move forward.
Yep, that makes sense. And, one last question before we sign off today. Every channel as a marketer, right? You test out a new channel, there is always a fair amount of risk, right? There is a chance you're going to burn your hands. If somebody is testing out influencer marketing, what's one tip or advice you would give so that they either do justice while testing out this platform or channel, and, know whether they did a good experiment or not, or, find ways where they're not going to burn themselves?
I think it's important, as we discussed earlier, not to put all of your eggs in one basket. If you have the opportunity, to work with influencers and you have any budget to, again, I would rather work with 3 smaller influencers than one large one, because it gives you the ability to test and learn against which of them will be most effective. And I think ultimately the more, it's a question of quantity over quality slightly in this instance, because, again, if you can work with multiple influencers, you have the ability to tap into multiple audiences. And I would also recommend that people take into account that, an influencer at its core is organic content, right? So unless you're putting paid advertising and to promote said content, the reach and frequency of that content is going to be limited to the audience that that influencer currently has. I know I've experienced this myself personally, with clients, with brands, where ultimately, you go to them and you go, okay, great, we're gonna create this campaign and we're gonna put it on these channels and do X, Y, and Z, and you still have whether it be a founder or a CEO or leadership at a brand go, well, can't we just put it on Facebook? Won't people just see it if we put it on our Facebook? And you look at them cautiously and say, you realize that currently you're, let's say, again, in the sense of Facebook, you have a following of 1,000 people, let's say. That 1,000 people are the only people who are going to see that content relatively. Their social sharing will take into effect. So, okay, let's say 10% of that audience will share that content. So you're looking at 1,100 people potentially seeing your content. Gone are the days where, especially in social media, where, the social channels needed to promote organic content in order to get higher engagement on their platform. Those days are gone. You have to pay for that now. So that's, when you turn that CEO and you go, again, that's 1,100 people. Is that all you want to see this content? And they go, well, doesn't it just get like they don't understand still somehow. They still think that the internet, needs to be self-fulfilling prophecy. It's not that way anymore. So what the thing that we have to constantly, and it's odd to do so at this day and age, is to remind these brands that, again, we can post that, that on your social media, on Facebook, for instance, it'll get 1,100 people have the potential to engage with it. But if you really want anyone else to see it, we're going to have to put paid advertising. We're going to have to promote that. And again, when in social channels, especially when things are promoted these days, or when it's obvious that it's paid advertising, people are less likely to engage with it. So you kind of have to accept the fact that, do you want a more authentic, organic experience with less engagement, or technically less engagement, but ultimately be more potentially fulfilling from a brand promise or brand awareness standpoint, versus spending money to create that content and to promote it per se to an audience that may have no interest in it, and get you may have higher impressions and views, but your engagement rate is going to be much, much lower. So I often have to, again, it's odd that I have to remind people of this. The digital advertising is not what it once was. Social media is not what it once was. It has become a channel, and you have to create appropriate content for that channel, or it will not be engaged with, and it won't, quite frankly, it won't be seen.
Awesome, Aaron. That's great advice, and thank you so much for spending your time with us. I think this was fun. I had a lot of fun talking to you, and there's a lot of knowledge bits in this conversation that I'm sure our audience is going to enjoy. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome, Aaron. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye. Impulse, the influencer marketing podcast, is brought to you by Phyllo. Phyllo is the easiest way to get access to authenticated creator data from hundreds of different platforms. To know more about Phyllo, visit getphyllo.com. That's PHYLLO.com. Also, make sure to search for Influencer Marketing Podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or any of your favorite podcast listening platforms. And don't forget to click subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Phyllo, thank you so much for listening.